Death by firing squad. US President Donald Trump wants more of it to ramp up federal cases of capital punishment. And as the Justice Department and Trump put it, to protect public safety.
This is an easy win for him by ramping up the death penalty again and now allowing firing squads.
And I think some people would argue that execution by a firing squad might even be a less cruel and inhumane method of execution.
So what's humane and what's inhumane? And what about the electric chair and gas asphyxiation, which are also being expanded in federal prisons? We'll get to those. Here's how the US has carried out executions in recent decades, the vast majority by lethal injection. The firing squad has been used very rarely, and it's only approved by 5 US states and now by the federal government again. And his acting Attorney General Todd Blanche's explanation for expanding the speed and method of executions. The prior administration failed in its duty to protect the American people by refusing to pursue and carry out the ultimate punishment against the most dangerous criminals, including terrorists, child murderers and cop killers. Under President Trump's leadership, the Department of Justice is once again enforcing the law and standing with victims. Erik Kirschbaum is an American journalist based here in Berlin. He's worked at newspapers and news agencies in the US and lived in Nevada, where executions are legal and prisoners were executed in the 80s. How does it make you feel as an American citizen and journalist hearing firing squads may be back in vogue sometime soon?
That's quite an incredible development. It just shows Trump and his administration is determined to carry out as many death sentences as possible. The reasons are interesting. The pharmaceutical solution wasn't working that well anymore. So the Trump administration has now opened the way for firing squads, which does sound very barbaric. And it's a real shock for a lot of Europeans, a lot of people around the world. But in the United States, it's not quite such a big shock because the United States has been doing executions pretty regularly since 1976.
What sort of crimes are we talking about, just out of interest?
Yeah, these are really murders, really horrible murders, often involving police officers or multiple killings, things like that. And it's really only in some states. There's only a handful of states that do these executions, capital punishment. Most of the northern states, Midwestern states, do not have capital punishment. It's mostly Texas and Florida are the main states, especially Texas, where about a third of all the executions in the United States take place each year.
Yeah, I'm reading 4 states responsible for 76% of executions. Why these 4 states?
It's a different mentality in these states. The voters in these states want people to pay the ultimate price for the serious crimes they commit, and whereas in other states there's concern that it might not have been the person who actually killed the person who's on death row. Also concerns about the mental health of some of the people. Some people are not that, have mental problems. They might be forced into confessions of crimes they didn't make. It's just a different way of life, a different culture. I mean, a place like Texas has a much different tradition than a place like Connecticut or Massachusetts, and the voters in states like Texas want to see it. Also, judges in a state like Texas are elected. They're not appointed, they're elected. And so judges who are running for election also have their ear to the ground a bit more, and they know what the voters want. And in a lot of these Republican-dominated states like Texas, 80% of the people want capital punishment. So that these are all factors that come into play. One more thing about Texas is interesting. The clemency process, the appeals process, is a lot more streamlined. Lawyers don't have much of a chance to prevent the capital punishment from being carried out in a place like Texas because there's very little chance of an appeal being successful. So all these factors come together to make you much more likely to be executed if you're convicted of a serious murder in Texas than you would be in another state.
But are you concerned when it comes to when you use the word streamlining, do you ever worry that innocent people could be executed under a flawed justice system?
That's definitely the fear in a lot of states. That's why they don't have the capital punishment in New England and places like that, because there are fears the justice system does make mistakes. Since 2000, they've been reinvestigating a lot of murder convictions, and they found dozens of murder convictions have been overturned thanks to the use of DNA. This is one more argument that the opponents of capital punishment make, that there's a lot of innocent people. There's over 2,000 people on death row in the United States. That's a lot of people facing executions. And there's a fear that there's a lot of innocent people among them. And that's another reason why opponents of the death penalty are always bringing up these issues to prevent capital punishment from being used more,
Erik, when you talk about
widespread.
Support, do people still come to watch these executions?
In a lot of states, the victims' families are invited to come and watch, and for sometimes the victims' families, loved ones, it's an important process for closure. It's needed, and the reports, you can read regular reports about the executions, and the families are there. Also, there's often a reporter, often an AP reporter or journalists. Local journalists are invited to come into the rooms where these executions take place, and they report very soberly, very matter-of-factly what happens. The prisoner's face slumped, he jolted briefly, and then it was over. Just a very factual accounting of what happened, not any kind of sensationalism stuff.
Well, here are some photos of execution chambers in Salt Lake City, Utah, Richmond, Virginia. The US state of South Carolina, for example, is the latest to carry out death by shooting after a 15-year pause. Last year, it shot 2 inmates, and lawyers for one of those men alleged the executioners failed to hit a target on his heart and that he took over 80 seconds to die. In other cases, we're talking about lethal injections taking an even longer time to actually work. Tell me, what's more barbaric?
It's a very good question. All these instruments look very grisly, especially here in Europe, where there haven't been any capital punishment in a long time, or at least in Western Europe. So it does seem very gruesome, I understand, but Americans are in favor of it. I mean, opinion polls show even today a majority of over 52% still believe in capital punishment. So it's definitely a problem. But this wasn't your question. The original question was, the gruesomeness of it. That's the big issue in the United States. The Eighth Amendment to the Constitution talks about cruel and unusual punishment. Cruel and unusual punishment is banned under the Constitution, and that's exactly the argument a lot of defense lawyers use, that a firing squad or a lethal injection is cruel and unusual punishment if it doesn't work right away. If somebody takes 20 minutes before they pass away, or if the shots miss and the person groans, as happened a year or so ago, groans for a minute or two, that could well be seen in the courts as cruel and unusual punishment. That's the reason why firing squads are also not universally accepted, because there is an element of possibility of cruel and unusual punishment. It's also volunteers from within the prison staff are used for these firing squads. It's often 3 people, and they are anonymous and their names are kept private, but they do volunteer for this act, and they do fire at the heart. There's a little target set up of the person's heart, and they're supposed to aim for that. But there have been cases where people were not immediately killed, that it took a while. And this is more evidence used by opponents of capital punishment that this is a violation of the Constitution, because this is cruel and unusual punishment when people are not executed immediately, but rather it's drawn out over several minutes or longer.
Before I speak more about the ethics of this with the professor, there are interesting reasons why this is happening now. But let's just take a quick look at some numbers, which also surprised me. Here we can see that the number of executions globally has climbed sharply, almost doubling in the past 2 years. I should note that the 2025 numbers are just estimates and don't include China, which is believed to have executed hundreds each year. And the US is following that global upward trend, with executions rising, the number hitting a recent peak last year with 47 people killed by state governments. That puts the US among the top 10 countries carrying out executions. Someone who has the grim task of observing death penalty trends is Carolyn Hoyle from the University of Oxford Centre for Criminology. I asked her why it's come to this decision to push more for the firing squad.
Well, I think there's probably a number of reasons, one of which is that drug companies have been progressively restricting access to pentobarbital, the drug used in the 3-drug protocol that's used for executions by lethal injection. And that's been quite successful in restricting access to those drugs in different states and also in the federal system. And so they're always looking for new ways that they pretend are more humane, but also more accessible. So the fact that other states have retained the death penalty under firing squad, as well as other methods, including most recently nitrogen hypoxia, means that they're constantly having to look for other methods so that they don't have a situation they've had, which is a number of states in the past decade, because of poor access to drugs, have just not been executing people, which is fine with me, but it's obviously not fine with those states. And I think some people would argue that execution by a firing squad might even be a less cruel and inhumane method of execution, because we know about the long list of botched executions by lethal injection, as well as before that by electrocution. And there will be, I predict, many botched executions by nitrogen hypoxia. So they're forever looking for new methods of trying to kill their citizens, and indeed citizens of other states too.
Those botched incidents you refer to, though, due to, I believe, the fact that many doctors don't want to be involved in these injections, and prison staff are having to do that or having to put their hands up to do that.
Yes, I mean, doctors take an oath, which means that they're not meant to do harm, they're meant to prevent harm. And so for a doctor to be involved in the administration of a lethal injection goes against what they're meant to be doing. But of course, without a doctor, without a trained anaesthetist in particular, you can get the potential for botched executions, and things do go wrong. Even very basic things like trying to get a vein from somebody is actually very difficult. I don't know if you've ever given blood, but you sometimes have to assist people trying to put an injection in and to take blood, but you also might have to assist them in trying to get a needle into a vein in order to administer a lethal injection. And it's very challenging for people to expect a prisoner to assist with their own execution. It's barbaric, I would say.
Does using the firing squad make the US an outlier among countries that have the death penalty?
No, there are some countries in the Middle East that use the firing squad. Many countries around the world outside of the US use hanging, because a lot of countries retain the death penalty as a colonial relic from the UK. So that's the most common means of execution, but there are countries that use firing squads. Saudi Arabia stones people in certain circumstances, and of course lethal injection is very much more common in other countries now too. So China would be one example, which is the leading executioner in the world. China executes more people than any other country. They have on offer lethal injection or firing squad.
You mentioned earlier about the shortage of lethal chemicals as being a reason for this shift in the US as far as policy goes. Is it about that, or is it more about the rhetoric of harsh punishment, of deterrence?
Well, certainly the report that came out yesterday from the Department of Justice talks about deterrence, and it's always the key rationale that people who support the death penalty turn to, because there's an intuitive belief that the death penalty must present a deterrent to people. It makes sense to people. In fact, there has been many very rigorous empirical studies done in the US on capital punishment in the US, which is for what they tend to be first-degree capital murders. And not one study has been able to show that the death penalty deters more than a life sentence or a very long prison sentence would. So the deterrence argument, as I say, is intuitive, but empirical evidence does not support it. The same is true in countries around the world too. So there was a very rigorous study done in Hong Kong and Singapore, and it was found that having the death penalty in Singapore didn't make any difference to the homicide rates across those two otherwise very similar jurisdictions. So deterrence is something people go to, and they might think that having a firing squad might deter people more than having a lethal injection. I'm not sure that it would, even if deterrence theory could be proven to be true, because many prisoners, I think, might prefer a firing squad to a lethal injection. It's a very quick and very effective method, and the likelihood of something going wrong is tiny, whereas the likelihood of something going wrong with all the other execution methods, including hanging, including nitrogen hypoxia, is quite high. So a very quick, short and safe death, as it were, might be more attractive to prisoners rather than being a deterrent.
Now, the number of executions is on the rise, both in the US and globally. Can you finally just tell us a bit more about those trends and why they're happening?
Well, the number of executions in the US rose last year, I think, to about 45, 47, from having been declining for some years, but it's still much lower than it was in the late 90s and early 2000s, when the rates were closer to 100. So the fact that we've had, I think, about 11 states in the last couple of decades in America that have abolished the death penalty means you have fewer states executing people. There are also an increasing number of what we call abolitionist de facto states in America. Those are states that keep the death penalty on the law but don't execute in practice. And there are 42 countries around the world that are abolitionists de facto too. So people keeping the death penalty on the book but not executing, which seems like a very strange compromise, but that's happening. So knowing whether the execution rates are really increasing substantially around the world is quite difficult because, as I say, China is the leading executioner and they keep their rates secret. It's a state secret, as do Vietnam. The rates where they've increased are countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. So there has been an increase in those countries. For Iran, a lot of that is around drug trafficking, not around the kind of offences that lead to the death penalty in America. So yes, we had an increase in America last year, but I think a lot of those cases were the states catching up with people who have not been executed while access to the pentobarbital drug was problematic for them. So I'm not sure that we can really say for certain there's an international trend. I'd want to see figures for quite a few more years to say that is the case. And as I say, it's 5 or 6 countries that really do make up those numbers, and most countries that retain the death penalty, you have very occasional executions or indeed none.
Now, for someone tracking US politics and Trump's rise to power, I guess none of this is a surprise to you, because in his first term, Trump resumed capital punishment after a 20-year pause. 13 federal prisoners were killed via lethal injection. And let's listen into one of his campaign promises prior to his second term in office.
And I'm hereby calling for the death penalty for any migrant that kills an American citizen or a law enforcement officer.
Erik, put this into context for us, because it's all highly politicized. I've read about a couple of documented cases, but has there been a migrant surge in crime that I haven't read about?
Well, there's a lot of killings in America. About 10,000 people are killed each year. The country is awash with guns, over 400 million guns in a country with 300 million people. So there's a lot of guns in the United States, a lot of killings. And there are a substantial number of illegal immigrants to the United States who are involved in some awful crimes. And these sometimes are picked up by the media and they take on a life of their own, especially in social media, especially among some Republican voters. They really make a big issue of it. So there is definitely some concern about this. And by the way, Donald Trump has been pushing the death penalty since he was a real estate mogul in New York in the late 1980s. It was an awful raping of a woman in Central Park. 5 young Black and Latino men were arrested and more or less coerced into making confessions for a crime they didn't commit. They were later exonerated about a decade later, but Donald Trump made a big advertisement in the New York Times, called for the death penalty against these 5 young Black and Latino men. So Donald Trump has been scoring political points since the late 1980s by calling for the death penalty. And among the MAGA voters, the far-right voters, the Republican voters, it does strike a chord. It's something his supporters do like, and they do like him for. And Donald Trump likes to talk about promises made, promises kept. He likes to make good on some of his campaign promises. And for Donald Trump and his Justice Secretary now, this is an easy win for him by wrapping up the death penalty again and now allowing firing squads.
There have also been a couple of cases the other way around. The news we reported on extensively of the federal immigration agents killing US citizens in operations like in Minneapolis this year.
Yeah, exactly. That was a horrible crime, and the Trump administration at first tried to put a horrible spin on it, saying that these were terrorists, domestic terrorists. And the videos, there was hundreds of videos from people, eyewitnesses there, and that pretty much knocked out the theory that these were terrorists. That they showed that these people were shot to death. These Americans were shot to death just for taking part in protests. And so the reaction was pretty strong and swift, and Trump and the Trump administration did back down very quickly. They made changes in Minneapolis to calm the situation. And the justice system is investigating these incidences, and there's a lot of hope and concern that the ICE officials who did these murders will be brought to justice.
Is it winning Trump lots of votes through these kinds of policies?
Trump is struggling right now for a lot of other reasons, the economy mainly. But among his supporters, this is something they like. And this is something some people voted for Trump because of issues like this, and they want him to follow through on his promises, and he's doing that. There are parts of the country, the United States, where capital punishment is really popular and is expected. People believe it's a deterrent. And if nothing else, they believe it's a just penalty for somebody who kills a police officer or kills a bunch of people. A lot of law enforcement officers in the United States are murdered each year. This is not something that happens once a decade. No, it happens many times each year. And there are American voters who believe this is a deterrent that could save the lives of police officers in the future by being a deterrent. The jury's out on this. Some people argue, no, it's not true, but some people do believe it. And the important thing is the voters in these states do believe it, and they're voting for Donald Trump, and they're voting for judges who do enforce the death penalty.
Well, a Gallup poll found support for the death penalty is at a 50-year low, with just 52% of Americans approving of it. But let's bring in the president again for some more context here from you, Erik.
Okay, this is the death penalty for somebody that kills people in Washington, D.C. I think it's capital. It's a very interesting capital punishment, capital city, right? It's capital. But this is our capital city. We can't allow that to happen. People come in from Iowa to look at the Lincoln Memorial and they end up getting killed. It doesn't happen anymore. It's not going to happen. And if it does happen, it's the death penalty for the person that did it. And this goes into effect.
So there's the president delivering on promises, as you put it before. Where's all this leading, do you think, when it comes to law and justice in the US and how people perceive as whether or not they're living in a safe country?
That's a good question. A lot of people don't really feel that safe in the United States. It's another reason why there's so many guns. People feel they need guns to protect themselves from people who don't have guns. But Washington, D.C. is an interesting case. It's not really a northern city, but it is pretty far north. Virginia is a state nearby, used to have the death penalty. They took that away a few decades ago. So Washington, D.C. is a fairly northern city for a place where capital punishment is now going to be allowed. It's sort of an outlier there in the North. And so Trump is using his power over Washington, D.C. to allow capital punishment for crimes committed in the city of Washington, D.C., which is not a state. It's just a District of Columbia, which the president has a lot of authority over. It's more of a symbolic thing. There won't be a bunch of prisoners in D.C. executed anytime soon. But he's trying to make a point, and he's using capital punishment as another one of these wedge issues to rally his voters. It's red meat to Trump supporters. They love this kind of thing. They love when he's taking a hard line on it. And he's very popular among law enforcement officials in the United States. Across the country, police unions, police officers do support Trump almost blindly. And this is the kind of thing they love. This shows that the president is standing up for law enforcement officers who are in danger of being killed for ridiculous small infractions, routine car stops, and sometimes police officers do get shot. It does happen quite a bit. Anyway, so Trump is trying to score points with his voters. With Donald Trump, most things often do have a political background, and this is what he's trying to do, score points with his voters and supporters.
Erik, one final thing. You mentioned the farmer angle to all of this. How difficult is it now getting the pharmaceuticals needed for a lethal injection, for example? Because that's what the officials are saying at the moment, that because of those difficulties, they're looking at reintroducing firing squads.
Yeah, pharmaceutical companies have taken steps to make sure that their products are not used for these lethal injections, and that's what caused these problems for a lot of states where they do executions. They weren't able to get the drugs, the pharmaceuticals they needed for these lethal injections. So that's why they've had to turn to other methods like the firing squad or electrocution. So it's really interesting to see that the pharmaceutical companies found some morality along the line and found maybe pressure from their shareholders, pressure from suppliers, that they don't want to be involved in this process. And the prisons themselves, doctors are also opposed to the death penalty, and doctors do not participate in these lethal injections or these executions. It's pretty much left to prison officials who are not usually as trained as well as doctors. So it's interesting to see the pressures, the external pressures coming in and making it more and more difficult for capital punishment in the United States. And these are all reasons behind a slow but steady decline in the number of executions until recently, at least, that we've been seeing.
And when it comes to external pressure and the question of morality, that's what the world has the Pope for. After the Department of Justice announced it is expanding its death penalty options, Pope Leo called for the US to abolish it altogether.
Effective systems of detention can be and have been developed that protect citizens, while at the same time do not completely deprive those who are guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. And I likewise offer my support to those who advocate for the abolition of the death penalty in the United States of America and around the world.
What do you think? Do the methods matter, or shouldn't capital punishment exist at all? Let us know in the comments section. I'm Ben Fazulin. Thanks for watching and see you next time.